31 years. That's longer than some of your kids have been alive, longer than most marriages last, longer than some people stay in the same city. Raymond Kowalski gave 31 years to one company. He knew every machine on that floor by the sound it made when something was wrong. He trained the guys who trained the guys who are working there right now. On a Tuesday morning in November, two security guards he had never seen before walked up behind him while he was in the middle of a calibration check and asked him to come with them. He didn't argue. He didn't make a scene. He picked up his coffee thermos, the green one Donna had packed that morning, and he walked out. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, is that when they handed him back his laptop at the end of that hallway, they handed him everything.
The Last Tuesday.
My name is Raymond Kowalski. Most people call me Ray. I'm going to tell you something I've never said out loud to anyone except my wife Donna, and that was only after a glass of bourbon on a Friday night when the house was quiet and the kids had already gone home. I am not a man who cries easily. But on the morning of Tuesday, November 12th, when I pulled into the parking lot of Midland Precision Manufacturing on East Jefferson Avenue in Detroit, the same parking lot I had pulled into for 31 years, I had a feeling I couldn't shake. Something small and cold sitting right in the center of my chest. I didn't know what it was. I told myself it was the temperature. It was 23 degrees that morning. My breath was fogging up the windshield of my F-150, even with the heat running. I was wrong about the temperature. Let me tell you who I am because it matters. I'm 57 years old. My father came to Detroit from Gdansk, Poland in 1971 with $60 and a cousin's phone number. He worked the line at an auto plant for 33 years and retired with a pension and 2 bad knees and the kind of quiet dignity that men of that generation carried without ever naming it. He never missed a day of work that I can remember. Not one. Not when it snowed. Not when it rained. Not when my mother had her surgery and he drove 40 minutes to the hospital at 5 in the morning before his shift. I watched that man my entire childhood. I understood without anyone explaining it to me that the way you showed your family you loved them was by showing up every single day, without complaint, without drama. So that's what I did. I started at Midland Precision at 26 years old as a maintenance technician, level 1. I didn't have a college degree. I had a 2-year certificate from Detroit Technical and a work ethic I'd inherited from a man who didn't speak fluent English until he was 40. Midland made industrial components, precision parts for aerospace, automotive, defense contractors, the kind of parts where a ½ millimeter of tolerance error doesn't get you a bad review. It gets someone killed. I learned that early. I took it seriously. The machines on our floor were my responsibility, and I treated them that way. By year 5, I was lead technician. By year 12, senior maintenance supervisor. I trained 47 people over my career. 47. I still remember most of their first days. Nervous hands, trying to look confident, asking questions they thought were stupid. I told every single one of them the same thing on day 1. These machines don't care about your title. They don't care about your resume. They care about whether you pay attention, and this floor will never lie to you. That was my philosophy. 31 years of paying attention. My life outside the plant was not complicated. Donna and I bought our house on Harrington Street in 1998. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, aluminum siding that I repainted myself every 7 years. The kind of house where you know your neighbors' names and their kids' names and which dog belongs to which yard. We raised 2 kids in that house. Kevin, who's now 30 and works for a logistics company in Cleveland, and Patty, 28, a nurse in Ann Arbor. We paid off the mortgage in 2019. Donna cried when we burned the papers. I grilled steaks that night, and we sat on the back porch until 11 o'clock. I don't remember exactly what we talked about. I just remember thinking, this is what it was all for. That's the life I was living on November 11th, the night before everything changed. Donna made chicken soup that Monday night. She always made chicken soup when it got below freezing. I sat at the kitchen table reading a Field and Stream magazine I had read 3 times before, because the subscription ran out and I kept forgetting to renew it. The evening news was on in the other room. Normal, completely normal. She asked me if I wanted more coffee. I said yes. She poured it. I said, "Thank you, hon." She went back to the sink. I have replayed that Monday night 1,000 times since then, not because anything dramatic happened, but because I was so completely at peace. I had absolutely no idea what Tuesday morning was going to be. Now, I need to tell you about a man named Craig Delaney, because without Craig Delaney, none of this makes sense. Craig Delaney arrived at Midland Precision 18 months before that Tuesday, VP of Operations, 39 years old, MBA from Wharton. He came from a consultancy in Chicago that specialized in what they called operational transformation, which, as far as I could tell, meant going into companies that had been running fine for decades and replacing things that worked with things that looked better in a PowerPoint presentation. His first week, he walked the floor in shoes that cost more than my first paycheck. Not work boots, dress shoes, on a manufacturing floor where grease and metal shavings covered everything and the temperature could drop to 40 degrees in winter. I watched him from across the floor and I thought to myself, this man has never fixed anything in his life. I don't say that to be cruel. It's just a fact I recognized immediately. There's a difference between people who manage things and people who know things. Craig Delaney knew how to manage. He did not know things, but he had the title. And in the 18 months that followed, that title was the only thing that mattered. The first time I understood what Craig was actually doing, it was a Thursday afternoon staff meeting in January. He called together all the department supervisors. I sat at that conference table, the same one I had sat at for 20 years, and he put up a slide. The slide said, Talent Refresh Initiative, Q1 through Q4 targets. I looked at the numbers. The targets were for what percentage of each department should be new talent by end of year. The target for my department was 40%. The woman next to me, Linda Sabo, who had been doing quality control at Midland for 24 years, leaned over and whispered in my ear. She said, "Ray, that's us." I looked at her. She was 61 years old. She had raised 3 kids, buried a husband, and never, not once in 24 years, let a non-conforming part leave that floor. I looked back at the slide. Talent Refresh, it said. My jaw was tight. I pressed my back teeth together hard enough that I felt it in my ears. And I thought the thought that I'm not proud of, but that I have to tell you honestly, because it's the truth. If I walk out of here right now, this whole floor shuts down within 6 months. He knows that. He has to know that. But I also thought something colder, something that settled in like ice water. He doesn't care. The months that followed were the longest of my career. One by one, the veterans started disappearing. Dave Corhonen, maintenance tech, 22 years, gone in February. Maria Gutierrez, lean supervisor, 16 years, gone in April. Tom Ellery, my right-hand man for 11 years, gone in July. Tom cried when they walked him out. He was 54 years old. His youngest was starting community college in the fall. Every time, the same process. A Friday afternoon meeting with HR, a box of belongings waiting by the security desk, an escort to the parking lot. I kept coming in every single morning because that's what I knew how to do, because I had 31 years invested and a pension that vested at 32, and I told myself, one more year. Just get to one more year. I told Donna I was fine. She didn't believe me. Donna never misses anything. But she didn't push, because she knew I needed to believe it myself for a while longer. And then, in October, 6 weeks before that Tuesday, something happened that I almost missed. Almost. I was running a routine calibration on Press 7, one of our oldest machines on the floor. 40 years old, that machine. I knew every sound it made, every vibration, every quirk, and during the calibration, I found something in the maintenance log that didn't match. It wasn't a big thing, on the surface. A notation about a safety valve inspection, signed off as completed on a date in August. Inspection passed according to the log. No issues found. But I had been on vacation that week in August, and I knew, because I always checked, that the only other person authorized to sign off on safety valve inspections for Press 7 was Tom Ellery, and Tom had been gone since July. I stood there with the logbook in my hand for a long time. My hands were not shaking. I want to be clear about that. They were completely still. That's the thing about 31 years of discipline. When something genuinely alarming happens, you don't panic. You get very, very quiet inside. I thought someone falsified this log, and then I thought, this is not the only one. I didn't say a word to anyone. I closed the logbook, I finished the calibration, I went back to my workstation, and I ate my lunch. Turkey sandwich, same as every Tuesday and Thursday. And I thought about what I was going to do next. That night, I opened my laptop at the kitchen table after Donna went to bed, and I started looking at every maintenance record I had access to for the previous 14 months. Every safety certification, every inspection sign-off. What I found over the next 3 hours changed everything I thought I knew about what was happening at Midland Precision. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because first, I need to tell you about Tuesday, November 12th. The day they walked me out, the day they handed me back the laptop, the day they made the biggest mistake of Craig Delaney's career. I had 31 years in that building. I knew every machine, every bolt, every sound. But the one thing I didn't know, and the one thing nobody had thought to tell me, was that everything I needed was already sitting inside that laptop. They gave it back to me, wrapped in a plastic bag like it was garbage. I put it in the passenger seat of my truck. I drove home, and I opened it. Tuesday, November 12th, started like every other Tuesday of my life. 5:15 a.m. alarm. I hit it once, never twice. My father never hit it twice, and neither do I. Donna was still asleep. I made coffee in the kitchen, poured it into the green thermos she had given me for Christmas 3 years ago. Stainless steel, keeps it hot for 6 hours. Has a small dent on the left side from when I dropped it in the parking lot in February. I know that thermos better than I know most people. I drove east on Jefferson in the dark. The temperature was 23 degrees. The roads were dry, but the air had that quality to it, sharp, metal tasting, that Detroit gets in November when winter stops being a forecast and starts being a fact. I pulled into my usual spot, Space 14. I had parked in Space 14 for so long that other people just left it for me, even though it wasn't assigned. Nobody ever said anything about it. It was just understood. I sat in the truck for a moment, drank some coffee, watched the lights in the plant. That cold thing in my chest was back, heavier than the day before. Stop it, I told myself. Go do your job. So I did. I was in the middle of a calibration check on Press 4 at 10:14 a.m. when I heard footsteps behind me that didn't belong to anyone I knew. You learn, after 31 years on a floor, to identify people by the way they walk, the weight of their step, the rhythm, the shoes. I knew Dave's shuffle. I knew Linda's quick clip. I knew Craig Delaney's hard leather soles, always that same aggressive look-at-me cadence. These footsteps were different, soft-soled, uncertain, 2 sets, synchronized in a way that working people don't walk. I turned around. 2 men I had never seen in my life. Polo shirts with a security company logo I didn't recognize. Young, maybe late 20s. Both with that carefully neutral expression that people wear when they've been told to keep things calm. The taller one spoke first. He said, "Mr. Kowalski, could you come with us, please?" Not a question. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because I think it's important to be honest about it. My first thought was not dignified. My first thought was, is this about the logs? because in the back of my mind, buried under the routine of the morning, those falsified maintenance records had been sitting there for 6 weeks, like a stone I couldn't stop turning over. My second thought, and this is the one I'm not proud of, was about the pension. 31 years and 11 months. 1 month short of 32, 1 month short of full vesting. I don't know why I thought about the pension before I thought about Donna. That still bothers me. My third thought was the one that settled everything. Don't give them a scene. You are Raymond Kowalski. Your father worked 33 years and never once gave anyone a scene. You are not going to start now. I picked up my coffee thermos from the workbench. Slowly. I didn't rush. I didn't look around for someone to make eye contact with, because I knew that if I made eye contact with anyone I knew, anyone who had worked beside me for years, I was going to have a much harder time keeping myself together. I said, "All right, just that. All right." And I walked with them. The floor is long. From press 4 to the corridor exit is maybe 200 feet. I have walked that distance thousands of times in my life. I could walk it blind. That morning, it was the longest 200 feet I have ever covered. I could hear the machines, the hum and compression, and cycling that I had spent 31 years learning. And I thought, I know this sounds like something a person says later to make the story better, but I swear to you, it is exactly what I thought in real time. These machines are going to tell on you eventually. I taught them to, and you don't even know it yet. The HR office was the small one off the main corridor, not the big conference room. That told me something. The big conference room is where you take groups. The small office is where you take one person when you need the whole thing to be quiet. Craig Delaney was not there. I noticed that immediately. In 18 months, he had restructured half the department, eliminated 11 veteran positions, and rewritten the safety inspection protocols. And he didn't have the spine to be in that room for the last one. It was a woman from HR named Sandra. She had a folder in front of her, and she was looking at me with the expression that people use when they want you to believe they feel bad about something they already decided weeks ago. She said the word restructuring. She said the phrase position elimination. She mentioned a severance calculation. I let her finish. Every word of it. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. I didn't ask if there was any other option, because I already knew there wasn't, and asking would only have made me look like I didn't understand what was happening. I understood exactly what was happening. When she finished, she slid a paper across the desk. The severance package was for 11 weeks, for 31 years of employment. 11 weeks. I did the math in my head while I was looking at the paper. That's roughly 3.5 days per year of service. I have a drill bit in my garage that's given me more value per year than that. I signed it. Not because I had to sign it that moment. She gave me 24 hours. But because I had already decided that I was not going to sit across from this woman and negotiate the terms of my own removal from a place I had given my adult life to. I had too much dignity for that. I signed it, put the pen on the desk, and stood up. Sandra looked slightly surprised. I think she had expected more resistance. People usually do when they've underestimated someone. I said, "Where's my things?" She said, "Security has them at the front desk." I nodded. At the door I stopped. I don't know why I stopped, but I turned back and looked at her, and I said, "And I want you to understand, this was not a threat. It was just the truth coming out of my mouth before I could think about it. Sandra, I hope whoever is signing off on the safety inspections now knows what they're doing." She didn't answer. Her expression changed in a way that I filed away and didn't think about again until much later. I walked out. At the front desk there was a cardboard box with my things. Donna's photo. A small Detroit Tigers bobblehead that Kevin had given me 15 years ago. A spare set of safety glasses, a tube of hand lotion because my knuckles crack in the cold. And next to the box in a clear plastic bag was my company laptop. I took the box, I picked up the plastic bag with the laptop, I put both in the crook of my arm, and I walked out to Space 14 for the last time. I sat in the truck for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because I watched the clock. It was 11:03 when I got in. It was 11:14 when I started the engine. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that, not because crying would have been wrong, but because people who know me would want to know. I did not cry in that parking lot. I sat completely still with my hands flat on my thighs, and I breathed, and I thought about my father, and I thought about Kevin and Patty, and I thought about Donna making chicken soup on a cold night. And then I drove home. Donna was in the kitchen when I came through the door at 11:47 in the morning. She took one look at me, just one. And she set down whatever she was holding, and she came across the kitchen and put her arms around me, and didn't say anything for a long time. I told her what happened. She pulled back and looked at my face, and she said, "This is my wife of 33 years, who has known me longer than I worked at Midland." She said, "Ray, what aren't you telling me?" I looked at her. I said, "There's something wrong in those plants, Donna. Something I found 6 weeks ago. Something I need to look at more carefully." She didn't ask me to explain it right then. She just said, "Then sit down. I'll make coffee. And you tell me everything." That night, after Donna went to bed at 10, I opened the laptop at the kitchen table. Now, here is something important, and I need you to understand this, because this is where everything changes. When a company issues you a laptop and then terminates your employment, there is a standard IT protocol. The device should be remotely wiped before it's returned to the employee or immediately upon return. Formatted, cleared, all company data removed. Craig Delaney's Talent Refresh initiative had cut the IT department from 6 people to 2. The 2 remaining IT staff were both under 30, both overwhelmed, and on November 12th, the day I was walked out, one of them was out sick. Nobody wiped the laptop. 31 years of discipline and paying attention, and the one time it truly paid off was the night I sat down in front of a machine that a 22-year-old IT coordinator forgot to clear, and I started reading. In a folder on the desktop labeled Q3 Maintenance Archive, a folder that should not have been on an employee laptop at all, were 14 months of maintenance reports. Not the official reports, the real ones. The ones that showed what the inspections had actually found before they were edited for the official record. I scrolled through them, 1 page, 2 pages, 10 pages, 30. My hands were completely still on the keyboard. The house was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside it was snowing. By the time I reached page 47, I understood 3 things with absolute certainty. 1, safety valve inspections on 7 different machines had been signed off as compliant when they had not been inspected at all. Not by me, not by Tom Ellery, by nobody. The signatures were fabricated. 2, this had been happening since March, 8 months before my termination. 8 months in which equipment that my former colleagues were operating every single day had not received required safety certifications. 3, if any of those machines failed, and based on what I was reading, at least 2 of them were significantly overdue for service, the consequences would not be a lawsuit. The consequences would be someone getting hurt, or worse. I closed the laptop. I put my hands flat on the table. It was 1:23 in the morning. I had a decision to make. And I want you to understand that for about 4 minutes, I genuinely considered doing nothing. I had been walked out of that building with 11 weeks of severance after 31 years. I owed them nothing, less than nothing. The rational, self-interested version of Raymond Kowalski could have closed that laptop, poured the rest of the coffee down the drain, and gone to bed. That version of me doesn't exist, because those weren't abstract machines in an abstract building. Those were the machines that Dave Korhonen was working near every morning. That Maria Gutierrez's replacement, a 24-year-old kid from Hamtramck who had been on the floor for 6 weeks, was learning to operate. That 112 people who still had their jobs were going to walk past tomorrow morning and the morning after that, and the morning after that. My father spent 33 years keeping his head down and never once made trouble for anyone. I am my father's son in almost every way, but not in this one. I went upstairs. Donna was awake. She always wakes up when something shifts in the house. She says she can feel it. She was lying there in the dark with her eyes open. I said, "I know what I'm doing tomorrow." She said, "Tell me." I told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Ray, if you do this, they're going to come after you. You know that." I said, "I know." She said, "And you're doing it anyway." I said, "Donna, there are people on that floor who have no idea what's underneath those machines." She looked at me in the dark for a long time. Then she said the thing that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. She said, "Your father would have done the same thing." The next morning, I didn't drive to Midland Precision. I drove to the Federal Building on West Lafayette Boulevard. I had the laptop in the passenger seat. I'd printed 47 pages of documentation the night before at the FedEx on gray sheet. And I had written in longhand on a yellow legal pad the names of every machine, every false sign-off date, and every person I believed was at risk. I had been a maintenance technician for 31 years. I had spent my entire career making sure those machines didn't hurt anyone. I wasn't done yet. The Federal Building on West Lafayette Boulevard in downtown Detroit is not an impressive place. It's gray concrete and fluorescent hallways, and a security line where they make you take off your belt and put your keys in a plastic bin. I walked through that security line with a laptop in a plastic bag, 47 printed pages in a manila envelope, and a yellow legal pad with 2 pages of handwritten notes. I asked the guard at the desk where I could find OSHA. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Second floor. Turn left at the elevator." I said, "Thank you." I took the elevator. I said to the woman at the reception window, "I need to report falsified safety inspection records at a manufacturing facility. I have documentation." Within 20 minutes, I was sitting across a table from a federal compliance investigator named Agent Patricia Howe. She looked at my envelope. She looked at my laptop. She looked at me. She said, "Mr. Kowalski, walk me through what you found." So I did. I talked for 1 hour and 40 minutes without stopping. I walked her through every machine, every false sign-off, every date. I showed her the archived reports on the laptop. I showed her my handwritten notes. I showed her the specific machines I believed were operating outside safe certification parameters right now, today, with people standing next to them. At one point she stopped writing and looked up at me over her glasses. She said, "Mr. Kowalski, were you terminated before or after you found this?" I said, "I found the falsified logs 6 weeks ago. I was terminated yesterday." She wrote something down. Then she said, "Did anyone at the company know you had found them?" I thought about Sandra's expression when I mentioned the safety inspections at the door. I said, "I believe so." "Yes." She wrote something else, something longer this time. Agent Howe told me the investigation would begin within 48 hours. She told me I should retain copies of everything. Then she asked me one more question before I left. She said, "Mr. Kowalski, why are you bringing this forward now? You were let go yesterday. You signed a severance agreement. Most people in your position would walk away." I looked at her. I said, "Agent Howe, I spent 31 years making sure those machines didn't hurt anyone. I'm not going to stop doing that because they handed me a box and walked me to the parking lot." She held my gaze for a moment. Then she said something that wasn't official, wasn't part of the interview, wasn't written on her legal pad. She said, "Good. The OSHA inspection of Midland Precision was authorized on November 15th. On November 18th, federal inspectors arrived unannounced at the plant on East Jefferson Avenue. The inspectors found what I told them they would find, and then they found more. The 7 machines I had flagged, all 7 confirmed, but the inspectors didn't stop there. They pulled the full 14-month maintenance record for the entire floor. The total number of falsified or improperly signed safety inspection records across all equipment, 41, not 7, 41. Craig Delaney had not just cut corners. He had built a system for cutting corners, a process by which safety documentation was completed on paper by personnel who had never set foot near the machines in question, in order to satisfy regulatory requirements on schedule without the expense of actual inspections. He had done it to hit his Q3 operational efficiency targets. He had done it to look good in a PowerPoint presentation. The plant was issued an immediate stop work order on November 19th for the highest risk equipment. Craig Delaney was placed on administrative leave on November 2nd. He resigned on December 4th. I heard about it from Linda Sabo. She called me on a Saturday morning. I was in the garage replacing the brake pads on Donna's Camry. She said, "Ray, he's gone." I set down the wrench. I said, "Who told you?" She gave me the details. When she finished, there was a moment of quiet on the line. She said, "Ray, you saved someone's life. You know that, right? One of those machines, the inspectors said, if it had gone another 60 days without service, it would have failed. And when press machines fail," she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I said, "Linda, how are you doing?" She laughed a little. She said, "I'm okay. I'm better than okay." In February of the following year, the investigation concluded. Midland Precision Manufacturing was cited with 41 OSHA violations. The total fine assessment was $847,000. Because my termination 6 weeks after discovering the falsified records constituted retaliatory dismissal under federal whistleblower protection statutes, we settled for $847,000, the same number as the OSHA fine. My attorney thought I was being sentimental about the number. She was right. I didn't care. Craig Delaney was separately charged with federal OSHA record falsification violations. He entered a plea agreement in March. His LinkedIn now says he's an independent consultant. I opened Kowalski Industrial Safety Consulting, LLC in April. Just me out of the spare bedroom. I specialize in compliance audits for mid-size manufacturing facilities, independent inspections, the kind of thing that catches what gets missed when the people responsible for catching it are too busy protecting their Q3 numbers to actually look. The kid from Hamtramck, his name is Eddie, still works at Midland. He sent me a message on LinkedIn in March. It just said, "I didn't know your name until I read the article. I just wanted to say thank you." I read that message at the kitchen table. Donna was washing dishes at the sink. I read it twice. Then I typed back, "Pay attention, Eddie. The machines will always tell you the truth if you listen." He wrote back with a thumbs-up emoji. My father would not have known what a thumbs-up emoji was, but I think he would have understood the sentiment.
Raymond Kowalski didn't set out to be a hero. He set out to go to work on a Tuesday morning, the same way he'd done for 31 years. They escorted him out, they handed him a box, and they gave him back a laptop that they forgot to wipe. Because when you spend 18 months cutting the people who actually know things, eventually something slips. Here's what I keep thinking about. Ray didn't do any of this for the money. He did it because there was a 24-year-old kid standing next to a machine that hadn't been properly inspected in 8 months, and that was not something Raymond Kowalski was capable of walking away from. The lesson isn't document everything, though you should. The lesson is this. The people who treat workers like they're disposable almost always forget that those workers were the ones holding the whole thing together, and the day they walk them out is the day they lose control of what those workers knew. They gave Ray the weapon. They just didn't know it was loaded. Before we go to the next story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever stayed silent about something at work because you told yourself it wasn't your problem anymore? Drop it in the comments, because the next story is about a woman who did the math on her own husband's medical bill and discovered that what was happening to her family was happening to thousands of other people. And she had proof. Don't go anywhere. You've gotten a medical bill that didn't make sense. Almost everyone watching this has. You stare at it, you think, that can't be right. And then you call the number on the back and spend 40 minutes on hold, and eventually someone explains something you don't fully understand, and you pay it. Because what else are you going to do? Brenda Coaster spent 9 years processing those bills from the other side. She knew exactly how they worked. She knew the codes, the systems, the patterns. And on an ordinary Tuesday night in Cincinnati, sitting at her kitchen table with her husband's hospital statement in her hand, she recognized something in the numbers that made her stomach drop. Not because it was confusing, because she understood it perfectly. This is the story of what one woman did with that knowledge and what it cost her before it changed everything.
The Invisible Invoice.
My name is Brenda Coaster. I'm 44 years old. I live in a 3-bedroom house on Fernwood Drive in Cincinnati, Ohio, with my husband Gary and our dog Biscuit, who is a beagle mix and the most emotionally available member of our household. I have 2 adult kids, Josh, who's 22, and works at a warehouse in Mason, and Kayla, 20, finishing her associate's degree at Cincinnati State. Gary works, or worked before everything changed, as an HVAC technician, 20 years in the trades, the kind of man who can diagnose a failing compressor by sound alone, and who will absolutely not ask for directions, even when he is 40 minutes in the wrong direction on I-71. I love him completely. That's important context for everything that follows. For 9 years, I worked as a billing analyst at Healthbridge Regional Insurance, a mid-size carrier based in Cincinnati that covered somewhere around 280,000 policyholders across Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana. Not a giant, not a household name outside the region. The kind of company that runs ads during local news and sponsors the 5K at the county fair. My job was to review medical claims submitted by healthcare providers, hospitals, clinics, specialists, and verify that the billing codes matched the services documented in the patient records before we processed payment. It's detail work, systematic, repetitive, and invisible to almost everyone except the people doing it. I was good at it. Not because it was exciting, it wasn't, but because I have the kind of brain that notices when numbers don't line up, and I find that satisfying in a quiet, unglamorous way. 9 years of reading CPT codes and ICD-10 classifications and procedure documentation. I could look at a claim and know within about 30 seconds whether something was off. That skill, as it turned out, was the most important thing I owned. I just didn't know it yet. I need to tell you about Gary's surgery first, because that's where everything starts. In March, about 14 months before any of this became what it became, Gary had a procedure on his left knee, a partial meniscectomy, outpatient surgery at St. Clement's Hospital. 45 minutes under anesthesia, home the same afternoon. His orthopedic surgeon was a man named Dr. Patel, who had the handshake of someone who did precision work for a living and the communication skills of someone who did not consider communication part of his job description. But Gary liked him. The knee was genuinely bad, and the surgery was straightforward. We had insurance through my employer, Healthbridge. Because of course we did. I was literally one of the people who processed claims for that company. 6 weeks after the surgery, the explanation of benefits arrived. I almost didn't look at it carefully. That's the thing I have to be honest about. We were busy. Gary was in physical therapy 3 mornings a week. Josh had just moved out and we were helping him get settled. I had a deadline at work. I almost just paid it, but I'm a billing analyst. Looking carefully at EOBs is what I do. So I looked. The total billed by St. Clement's was $18,400 for the procedure and associated services. Standard range for a partial meniscectomy. Our portion after insurance was $2,847. That number was consistent with our deductible and copay structure. Everything on the surface looked normal. But there was a line item that stopped me. CPT code 27332. Arthroscopic surgery with removal of a loose body from the knee joint. Gary had not had that. Dr. Patel had performed a standard partial meniscectomy. CPT code 27332 is a different, more complex procedure, more billable, more expensive. I sat with that for a moment. Then I went to Gary's surgical notes. We had copies because I always keep copies, and confirmed what I already knew. Code 27332 was not documented. It had not been performed. It had been billed. My first thought was, this is a data entry error. It happens. I've corrected hundreds of these myself. My second thought arrived about 45 seconds later, and it was quieter and colder. I process claims for this insurance company. I have seen this code combination before. Recently, multiple times. I put the EOB down on the table. I picked up my coffee. I set it down again without drinking it. I said, out loud, even though Gary was in the other room watching television and couldn't hear me, I said, that's not a mistake. I want to explain what upcoding is because it's important you understand what I was looking at. Upcoding is when a medical provider bills an insurance company, or Medicare or Medicaid, for a procedure more complex and more expensive than what was actually performed. Instead of billing for the procedure that happened, you bill for a procedure one level up the complexity scale. The difference per claim can be anywhere from $200 to several thousand. Multiplied across hundreds or thousands of patients over months or years, it becomes something else entirely. It is insurance fraud, federal insurance fraud, when it involves Medicare or Medicaid, civil fraud in private insurance contexts, and depending on the scale and documentation, potentially criminal. I knew all of this. I had known it abstractly for 9 years as part of my professional background. That night, sitting at my kitchen table in Cincinnati with Gary's EOB in my hand, I stopped knowing it abstractly. The next morning at work, I pulled up my claims queue and I started looking carefully, systematically, at every claim from St. Clement's Hospital that I had processed in the previous 6 months. I want to be precise. I was not snooping. I was not doing anything outside the scope of my job. Every claim in my queue was legitimately mine to review. I was doing exactly what I was paid to do. I was just doing it with a specific question in mind that I hadn't had the morning before. By 10:30 a.m., I had found 11 claims with the same pattern. CPT codes billed at a level of complexity that the accompanying documentation did not support. The same small upward shift, not dramatic enough to trigger an automatic audit flag. Consistent enough to be a system, not a coincidence. By the end of the day, across my entire processed backlog for St. Clement's over the previous year, I had flagged 37 claims. 37. In my queue alone. One analyst's queue. I closed the spreadsheet. I locked my computer. I walked to the break room and poured a cup of coffee that I didn't drink, and stood by the window for about 6 minutes looking at the parking lot. Here is what I was thinking. I need to bring this to my supervisor. That was the appropriate professional response. I had found potential billing irregularities in our claims data. My supervisor, whose title was Director of Revenue Cycle, was the correct person to escalate to. I had a meeting with him the next morning. I walked him through what I had found. I showed him the spreadsheet. I explained the pattern. I gave him the 37 flagged claims with documentation. He looked at the spreadsheet for about 90 seconds. Then he looked up at me. He said, "Brenda, are any of these claims currently in dispute?" I said, "No, they've been processed and paid." He said, "So there's no active payment issue?" I said, "There's a fraud issue." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I have replayed many times since. He said, "Brenda, St. Clement's is one of our largest provider network partners. Do you understand what I'm saying?" I understood exactly what he was saying. I said, "Yes." He said, "Good. I'll look into it." He did not look into it. I know this because over the next 3 months I watched. I kept doing my job. I kept processing claims, and the pattern from St. Clements continued. The same small upward coding shifts, the same inconsistency between billed complexity and documented procedure. I started keeping notes, not on my work computer. On a spiral notebook I bought at the Walgreens on Montgomery Road. Blue cover, college ruled, cost me $2.49. I wrote in it at home, at the kitchen table, after the kids had gone to bed, and Gary was watching sports. I wrote down every claim number, every CPT discrepancy, every date. I calculated the average upcharge per claim, $340, and began estimating scope. If my queue represented roughly 8% of total St. Clements claims volume at Health Bridge, and the pattern was consistent across all queues, the total fraudulent billing to Health Bridge alone could be in the range of $12 to $18 million over the period I could document. That number sat in my stomach like a stone. But Health Bridge was a private carrier. The thing that made that number something else entirely, the thing I hadn't fully thought through yet, was that St. Clements also accepted Medicare and Medicaid. And those were federal programs. I want to tell you the exact moment I understood what I was actually sitting on. It was a Thursday night in September. Gary had fallen asleep on the couch watching a Reds game. Biscuit was on my feet under the kitchen table. I was going through my notebook, running the numbers again with a calculator because I didn't trust my own math, and I wanted to be sure. I had been doing research on my phone over the past several weeks, careful research, the kind where you clear your browser history afterward. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because you haven't decided yet what you're going to do, and you don't want to explain the search results to anyone. I had found something called the False Claims Act, specifically a provision called qui tam. From the Latin, he who sues on behalf of the king as well as for himself. Under qui tam, a private citizen who discovers evidence of fraud against the federal government, including Medicare and Medicaid fraud, can file a lawsuit on behalf of the government. If the government investigates and recovers money, the whistleblower receives between 15 and 30% of the amount recovered. I sat with that for a long time. Biscuit put his chin on my foot. Gary snored once from the couch. I looked at my notebook. 14 weeks of documentation, 47 pages by then, claim numbers, dates, code discrepancies, calculated variance. My hands were not shaking. I want to tell you that my hands were shaking because it would make a better story. But they weren't. I was calm in the way that you get calm when you have been looking at a problem from every angle for 14 weeks, and you have finally identified the only solution that makes sense. The next morning, I drove to work. I processed my claims queue. I ate lunch at my desk, turkey wrap same as every Thursday. At 3:47 p.m., I received an email from HR. Subject, workforce restructuring, position elimination. My position was being eliminated effective in 30 days. The email was 3 paragraphs long. The third paragraph contained information about my severance package. I read it twice. Then I looked at my desk. At my monitor, my stapler, the small, succulent Gary had given me for my birthday 2 years ago, that I had kept alive against all reasonable expectations. And I thought, and I want to be honest with you because that's the only way this story makes sense. I thought, they know. Not for certain. I had no proof they knew. But my supervisor hadn't looked into the 37 claims. He had looked at me and said the name of their largest provider partner and let the silence do the work. And 3 months later, my position was being eliminated. It didn't matter whether they knew, because I had 14 weeks of documentation in a blue spiral notebook in my kitchen cabinet, and I had already looked up 3 qui tam attorneys in Cincinnati. I had just been waiting to see which way this was going to go. Now I knew. I drove home that night and I told Gary everything. Not a summary, everything. Every claim, every number, every conversation with my supervisor, every page of that notebook. He listened for a long time without saying anything. Gary is not a man who talks fast. He thinks, and then he speaks, and when he speaks, he means it. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Bren, how much are we talking about? Total, all of it." I told him my estimate. He looked at me. He said, "And you have proof?" I said, 14 weeks of it, in a notebook in the kitchen cabinet. He was quiet again. Then he said something I didn't expect. He said, "They did this to us, Bren." And they did it to how many other people? I didn't have an exact number yet, but I was about to find out. I called the first attorney on my list the morning after I got the termination email. Her name was Carol Finch. Qui tam litigation, healthcare fraud, 12 years of practice out of an office on Madison Road in Cincinnati. Her receptionist asked me what the call was regarding. I said, "I have documentation of a systematic healthcare billing fraud involving a regional hospital and a federal insurance program. I was employed by the insurance carrier. I was terminated yesterday." There was a brief pause. The receptionist said, "Can you hold for just one moment?" Carol Finch picked up 45 seconds later. We met in person 2 days later. I brought the notebook. I brought printed copies of every claim I had flagged, sanitized of patient identifying information, because I understood HIPAA and I was not going to compromise anyone's privacy in the process of doing the right thing. I brought Gary's EOB as the origin document. Carol Finch was 51 years old, small, with the kind of focused energy that makes you feel like she was already 3 moves ahead in a conversation before you finished your first sentence. She read through my materials for 22 minutes without speaking. When she looked up, she said, "How long did you work there?" I said, 9 years. She said, "And you kept all of this at home? Nothing on company devices?" I said, "The notebook is handwritten. My home printer. Nothing touched a company system after the initial review, which was entirely within my job scope." She nodded slowly. She said, "Brenda, do you understand what qui tam means in practice? Not the legal definition, the practical reality of what you're considering?" I said, "I know it's slow. I know it's sealed during the investigation. I know I can't talk about it publicly. I know the government can decline to intervene, and I know that if they do intervene and recover money, I'm entitled to a relator's share." She smiled, not a big smile. A small one, the kind that means you've done your homework. She said, "Most people who walk in here don't know half of that." I said, "I spent 14 weeks preparing for this conversation. Carol and I worked on the complaint for 6 weeks. 3 meetings in her office, documents spread across her conference table, going line by line through every claim I had flagged." She brought in a medical billing expert, a former CMS auditor named Dr. Helen Park, to validate my code analysis. Dr. Park reviewed my methodology and confirmed. The patterns I had identified were consistent with systematic upcoding, not random error. Random error, Dr. Park told Carol in a meeting I was present for, doesn't have a consistent directional bias. Every single discrepancy in Miss Custer's documentation codes upward, not one codes down. That's not a data entry problem. That's a system. We filed the complaint in Federal District Court in Cincinnati on a Tuesday morning in November, almost exactly 8 weeks after my termination. I drove home afterward and made lunch. Grilled cheese and tomato soup because it was cold, and I needed something that felt like comfort, and also because I didn't know what else to do with my hands while I waited. Gary was at a job site. I didn't call him. I sat at the kitchen table with biscuit on my feet, and I ate my lunch, and I thought, it's done. Whatever happens now, it's done. I told the truth, and I put it in front of the people whose job it is to act on it. That feeling, I want to describe it accurately, was not triumphant. It wasn't relief exactly. It was something quieter. The feeling you get when you've been carrying something heavy for a long time and you finally set it down. Not because someone took it from you, because you chose the right place to put it. The sealed period stretched from November into the following February before we heard anything substantive. I want to be honest about those months, because they were harder than I expected. We were living on Gary's income and my severance, 11 weeks. I had sent out job applications. I had 3 interviews, no offers. The healthcare insurance industry in Cincinnati is not enormous. I suspected my departure from Healthbridge was not helping. I didn't tell anyone why I was really unemployed. Not my mother. Not my sister Julie, who called every Sunday and asked how the job search was going in the particular tone that meant she was worried but didn't want to say so. Not Josh, not Kayla. Gary knew. Gary was the only one. On a Thursday night in January, when the severance had run out and we were having a conversation about the credit card balance that neither of us wanted to have, Gary said something that I held on to for the remaining months of the sealed period. He said, "Bren, I know this is hard, but you did the right thing. Whatever happens, you did the right thing. And I need you to know that I would rather be having this conversation than be married to someone who looked the other way." I looked at him across the kitchen table. I said, "Your knee surgery started this whole thing." He said, "Then my knee did something useful for once." I laughed. Actually laughed for the first time in a while. Biscuit lifted his head and looked at both of us like we had woken him from something important. In February, Carol called me. The Department of Justice had elected to intervene. I was standing in the cereal aisle at the Kroger on Montgomery Road when my phone rang. I looked at Carol's name on the screen. I stepped to the side next to the granola bars, and I answered it. She said, "Brenda, the government is in." I stood very still for a moment. A woman with a cart edged past me. I apologized and moved further to the side. I said, "What does that mean for the timeline?" Carol said, "It means they found enough in their preliminary investigation to commit resources. It means federal investigators are now formally on this. And Brenda, they found more than what you documented." I said, "How much more?" There was a brief pause. She said, "We'll talk in person, but I need you to understand, the scope of what the DOJ is looking at is significantly larger than the Healthbridge claims you brought them. What the federal investigation found, and what Carol walked me through in her office 3 days later, was this. The upcoding scheme at St. Clement's Hospital was not limited to claims submitted to Healthbridge. It was operating across all payer channels: private insurance, Medicare, Medicaid. The same directional bias Dr. Park had identified in my data, every discrepancy coding upward, never down, was present in the Medicare and Medicaid billing records as well. The scheme had been running for at least 4 years, possibly longer. The estimated fraudulent billing across all federal programs was $34 million. I sat in Carol's office and I looked at that number written on her legal pad in her precise handwriting. $34 million. Billed to insurance companies and federal healthcare programs for procedures that were documented at a lower complexity level than what was charged. Paid, processed, absorbed into the system. I thought about the other analysts in my department. I thought about how many of them had flagged things that went nowhere. How many of them had decided it wasn't worth the fight. I thought about Gary's EOB on the kitchen table, the one I almost didn't read carefully. The director of revenue cycle at Healthbridge, my former supervisor, was identified in the investigation as having been aware of the billing irregularities and having taken deliberate steps to suppress internal review. He was named as a co-defendant in the civil complaint. His name was Richard Albrecht. He had been with Healthbridge for 16 years. He drove a Lexus and coached his son's lacrosse team and had told me, with a straight face, that he would look into it. He was terminated by Healthbridge in April. His LinkedIn currently lists him as exploring new opportunities in healthcare operations management. I will let you draw your own conclusions about those opportunities. The settlement was finalized the following September. St. Clement's Hospital entered into a consent agreement with the Department of Justice. Total recovery to the federal government and private insurers, $34.2 million. Under the False Claims Act, as the relator, the person who filed the original complaint and whose documentation initiated the investigation, I was entitled to a relator's share. The share was set at 18%. 18% of $34.2 million. Carol called me on a Thursday afternoon. I was in the backyard with Biscuit, throwing him a tennis ball that he reliably refused to bring back. She said, "Brenda, are you sitting down?" I said, "I'm in the backyard. I'm not sitting down." She said, "Sit down." I sat on the back porch step. She told me the number. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Biscuit came and put his nose on my knee. I put my hand on his head. I said, "Carol, are you sure?" She said, $6.15 million. Yes, I'm sure. I sat on that back porch step for a long time after I hung up. Gary came out 10 minutes later. He had been inside watching football. He saw my face and he stopped in the doorway. He said, "Bren, what happened?" I looked up at him and I said the thing that I had rehearsed saying 100 times in my head during the long months of the sealed period, when I wasn't sure any of this was going to work out. I said, "Gary, do you remember that conversation we had in January about the credit card?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "We're not going to need to have that conversation anymore." He looked at me for a second. Then he sat down on the step next to me, and I told him everything, all of it, the number last. I need to tell you something about the morning the settlement became public. It was a Wednesday. The DOJ issued a press release at 9 a.m. First it was Carol confirming the release had gone out. Then numbers I didn't recognize, local news stations. Then my sister Julie, who had apparently seen something online. Then a number with a 202 area code. Washington, D.C. I answered it. It was a public affairs officer from the Department of Justice. She told me the press release had named St. Clements and Hellsbridge and referenced an unnamed relator. My name would not appear in any federal document unless I chose to make it public. That was my right under the False Claims Act. She said, "Miss Cousteau, on behalf of the department, I want to thank you for the quality and precision of the documentation you provided. Cases of this complexity don't reach resolution without that foundation." I said, "Thank you." I hung up. I sat for a moment. Then I called my sister Julie back. The press release said, in summary, St. Clements Hospital agreed to pay $34.2 million to resolve allegations of systematic healthcare billing fraud, spanning 4 years and affecting Medicare, Medicaid, and private insurance policy holders across Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana. The settlement included a 5-year corporate integrity agreement, meaning federal monitors would review their billing practices quarterly for 5 years. The hospital's chief revenue officer resigned the same day the settlement was announced. Richard Albrecht settled separately for $180,000 and accepted a 3-year exclusion from participation in federal health care programs. The number of policyholders who had been overbilled, who had paid higher copays and deductibles because the procedures charged to their accounts were coded at a higher complexity than what was performed, was identified in the investigation as approximately 4,200 people over the 4-year period. 4,200 people who got a bill that didn't make sense and called the number on the back and spent 40 minutes on hold and eventually had something explained to them that they didn't fully understand and paid it. Because what else were they going to do? I think about that number a lot. Most of them never knew what had happened to them. Most of them will never know that a billing analyst in Cincinnati sat at her kitchen table one night with her husband's EOB and noticed something that nobody was supposed to notice. I'm not telling you this to make myself sound heroic. I'm telling you because I think it matters that you know the actual scale of what quiet, systematic fraud looks like when it runs unchecked. It doesn't look dramatic. It looks like a line item on a document that most people don't read carefully. Carol finalized the relator's share disbursement in October. After her fees and federal taxes, the net amount that arrived in our account was $4.1 million. I'm going to tell you exactly what we did with it, because I think the choices people make with unexpected money say something true about who they are. We paid off the mortgage. That was first. Not because it was the financially optimal move, but because the feeling of owning the house on Fernwood Drive outright, with no claim against it, was worth more to me than any investment calculation. We set up college funds for Josh and Kayla, enough to cover whatever they decide to do next without debt following them into their 30s. Gary retired from HVAC. His knees, both of them now, not just the left, had been telling him to stop for 2 years. He stopped. He builds birdhouses in the garage on Tuesday and Thursday mornings and has developed opinions about wood grain that I find genuinely endearing. And I went back to work, not to Healthbridge, not to any insurance carrier. I opened a healthcare billing compliance consultancy. Independent audits for small and mid-sized medical practices and regional insurers. The kind of organizations that can't afford a full internal compliance department, but that are vulnerable to exactly the patterns I spent 9 years learning to recognize. My first client was a pediatric practice in Blue Ash. My second was a regional urgent care network in Dayton. I now have 7 clients. I work from the spare bedroom, the same one where I used to do the household taxes on weekends, with a dual monitor setup Gary helped me build, from parts, and a coffee maker that I consider a business expense. I charge fair rates, I find problems, I tell the truth about what I find. It turns out there is a significant market for someone who spent 9 years inside the system, understands exactly how the fraud works, and cannot be pressured by the word's important partner. The last thing I want to tell you about happened on a Saturday morning in November, almost exactly 2 years after Gary's surgical statement arrived in our mailbox. I was at the kitchen table, same chair, same coffee mug, and Gary came in from the garage with sawdust on his shirt and biscuit at his heels. He poured himself a coffee and sat across from me and looked at whatever I was working on with the expression he has when he's curious but doesn't want to interrupt. I looked up. He said, "What are you working on?" I said, "A billing audit, new client, orthopedic practice in Kenwood." He looked at me for a second. Then he looked down at his coffee. Then he looked back up, and there was something in his face, something warm and a little bit sideways. And he said, "You know what's funny? If my knee hadn't gone bad, none of this happens." I said, "Your knee, and the fact that I never stopped being a billing analyst even when I was sitting at this table at home." He said that too. We sat there for a moment. Biscuit put his chin on Gary's foot, and I thought about what it had cost. The 14 months, the silence, the severance running out, the Sunday calls with Julie, where I said everything was fine when it wasn't, and what it had given back. Not just the money, the knowledge that I had seen something that mattered and I had not looked away. 4,200 people. Most of them don't know my name. That's okay. I know what I did.
Brenda Coaster was not an activist. She was not a crusader. She was a billing analyst who understood CPT codes and noticed when the numbers didn't add up. She bought a $2.49 notebook at the Walgreens on Montgomery Road. She wrote in it at her kitchen table after her husband fell asleep. And she changed the financial reality of 4,200 people who will never know her name. Here's what I keep thinking about. How many Brendas are there? How many people are sitting right now at a desk in a company that is doing something wrong, something they can see clearly because of exactly where they sit, and have convinced themselves that it's not their problem, or that no one will listen, or that it's too risky? The fraud ran for 4 years. It ran for 4 years because it was designed to look like noise. Small enough per claim to feel like an error, big enough in aggregate to be worth $34 million. The only thing that stopped it was one woman who read her husband's medical bill carefully on a Tuesday night. The lesson isn't about money. The lesson is this. The people who build systems designed to steal from you in small amounts are counting on the fact that you won't add it up. Brenda added it up. Before we go to the final story, tell me in the comments, have you ever looked at a medical bill and thought something was wrong? Because more people than you think are right about that. The third story today is about a man who gave 6 years of his creative life to a woman who put her name on every single piece of it. And the night he finally decided to put his own name on his work, the internet responded in 72 hours in a way that nobody saw coming. Stay right there. For 6 years, Adrian Morse drew everything. Every silhouette, every fabric choice, every color story, every collection that went to Fashion Week with someone else's name on the program. He sat 3 feet from the woman who signed those collections. He watched her take bows he had earned. He listened to interviews where she talked about her creative vision, his creative vision, in the first person, with complete confidence, to rooms full of people who believed her. He smiled, he nodded, he went back to his desk, and he drew. Because he needed the job, because he had student loans, because he told himself that one day it would be different, that she would give him credit, that she would make him a named designer, that the arrangement would evolve into something fair. It didn't. But here's the thing about Adrian Morse. He had been drawing since he was 7 years old, and in 6 years of watching someone else take credit for his work, he had documented every single thing he ever made. This is the story of what happens when a man who spent 6 years being invisible decides it's time for the world to see his name.
Knockoff King.
My name is Adrian Morse Jr. I'm 32 years old. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, in a 2-bedroom apartment on Kings Highway Boulevard with my mother, my grandmother, and a sewing machine that my grandmother had owned since 1974 and treated like a member of the family. My grandmother's name was Odessa. She could make anything: curtains, church dresses, Halloween costumes, the lining of my winter coat when the original one wore through. She sewed at the kitchen table every Sunday afternoon after church, and I sat across from her and watched her hands. The way they moved fabric like it was a conversation she was having, not a task she was completing. I was 7 years old the first time I drew a dress, not copying anything, just something I saw in my head, a silhouette, a neckline, the way the hem would fall. I showed it to Odessa. She looked at it for a moment without saying anything. Then she looked at me. She said, "Adrian, you see things." I didn't fully understand what she meant until I was much older, but I kept drawing. I won a full scholarship to the fashion design program at Washington University in St. Louis. 4 years. Graduated second in my class. My thesis collection, 12 pieces, hand-constructed, centered on the intersection of West African textile traditions and American workwear, was featured in the program's end-of-year showcase and got a write-up in a regional arts publication. My mother came to that showcase. She sat in the front row. She was wearing a dress that Odessa had made her 15 years earlier, altered to still fit, still perfect. When my pieces came down the runway, she put both hands over her mouth. I had student loans of $34,000 when I graduated. I had a portfolio that I was proud of, and I had the specific combination of talent and financial reality that leads young designers to take jobs they might not take if the math were different. That's how I ended up at Varin. Varin was a women's contemporary fashion label based in Stwater, Louis, mid to high market, sold through specialty retailers and their own e-commerce, known for what the fashion press called sophisticated American minimalism. The founder and creative director was Patricia Varen, 58 years old, silver-haired, with the kind of confident authority that comes from 20 years of being the most powerful person in every room she entered. I interviewed with her in June, 6 weeks after graduation. The interview lasted 40 minutes. She looked at my portfolio for 11 of those minutes. I counted because I was nervous and counting helped, and didn't say anything for most of it. At the end, she said, "Your instincts are good. Your construction knowledge is better than most people I see. I want you to understand how this works here. You'll be developing concepts under my creative direction. The collections carry the Varon name. That's the brand. That's what the market responds to. Do you understand that? I was 26 years old. I had $34,000 in student loans. I said yes. I told myself it was temporary, an apprenticeship, industry standard, that I would learn, build my reputation internally, and that credit would cover. I want to be precise about what my job actually was, because I think some people imagine that developing concepts under creative direction means something more collaborative than what it was, what it meant in practice. Patricia gave me a seasonal mood board, images she had pulled from art books and travel photographs and magazine spreads, and a color palette. That was her creative direction. Everything after that was mine. The silhouettes, the fabric selections, the construction details, the proportion relationships, the specific design choices that made a Varon collection recognizable as a Varon collection. Mine. Patricia reviewed my sketches. She said yes or no. Sometimes she had a specific change. Usually she approved with minimal alteration. She attended the fittings. She stood next to the seamstresses while they constructed my designs and occasionally touched a seam and nodded. And then she presented the collections. Buyers, press, Fashion Week presentations, her name in the program, her name in the reviews, her name in the WWD coverage, my name nowhere. In the first year, I told myself this was normal. In the second year, I told myself I was paying dues. In the third year, I asked Patricia directly about credit. It was a Tuesday afternoon. We were in the review of the spring collection. I had just presented 18 sketches, 14 of which she approved with essentially no changes. I waited until the end of the meeting. Everyone else had left the room. I said, "Patricia, I want to talk about attribution, about how my contribution to the collections is presented externally." She looked at me. She had a way of looking at people that made the air feel slightly pressurized, like the temperature in the room had dropped 2 degrees without the thermostat moving. She said, "Adrian, what you do here is design for the Varon brand. The brand is the attribution. That's how fashion houses work." I said, "I understand that. I'm asking about my name specifically. A design credit, an associate designer title, something that," she said, "the NDA you signed is quite specific about proprietary creative work developed under employment. I'd encourage you to review it." She picked up her things and left the room. I sat there for a moment. Then I took out my notebook, the sketchbook I always carried, black cover, bought with my own money from the art supply store on Delmar, never a Varon company notebook. And I wrote the date and the time and exactly what she had said. I had been doing that since month 3, not because I had a plan, but because something in me, the part that grew up watching Odessa treat her work with reverence, could not accept that there was no record of what I made. Let me tell you about the fall collection, the one that changed everything. In February of my 6th year at Varon, Patricia gave me the mood board for fall. It was different from anything she had given me before. More personal, she said. Images of the Mississippi River at dawn, old photographs of St. Louis architecture from the 1940s, a particular quality of light she described as rust and silver. I went home that night and I drew for 4 hours straight, not sketching, drawing. The kind of drawing where your hand is moving faster than your thought and the work is telling you what it wants to be, not the other way around. By midnight, I had the bones of 12 pieces. By the end of that week, I had the full collection. 22 designs, the most cohesive thing I had ever made. I showed Patricia on a Thursday morning. She stood in front of my sketches for a long time, longer than usual. She said, "This is the best work you've done." I said, "Thank you." She said, "This is the one. This is the collection." I went back to my desk, and I want to be honest about this, I felt proud because it was good. It was genuinely good. And even though I knew, with the specific resignation of 6 years of practice, that my name would not be on it, in that moment, in that room, Patricia Varen had stood in front of my work and said, "This is the best." That meant something to me. It shouldn't have still meant something to me by year 6, but it did. The collection launched at a regional Fashion Week presentation in October. I was in the back of the room. I was always in the back of the room. The pieces came out. The audience responded. There was a sound that fashion audiences make when something genuinely moves them. Not applause, not yet, just this collective exhale of recognition. I heard that sound for my work, standing in the back of the room where no one could see my face. Afterward, there was a write-up in WWD, Women's Wear Daily. The headline called it Patricia Varen's most personal collection. The review described her creative evolution, her emotional maturity as a designer, her willingness to draw from her own history and landscape. My grandmother Odessa had sewn at a kitchen table in St. Louis for 50 years. The Mississippi River at dawn was in my DNA before it was in Patricia Varen's mood board. I read that review 3 times, and something that had been quietly building for 6 years, something patient and cold and utterly certain, finally finished forming. I did not quit the next day. I want to be clear about that, because the story might suggest a dramatic, immediate reaction. There wasn't one. What there was, instead, was clarity. I had been drawing since I was 7 years old. I had a sketchbook full of dated original designs going back to my first month at Varen. I had digital files, every sketch I had ever scanned, saved to my personal hard drive, never the company system, with creation timestamps going back 6 years. I had emails asking for Patricia's approval on designs that bore her responses. Love this. Yes. Move forward. Perfect. Exactly what I wanted to say. That last one. Exactly what I wanted to say. She had written that in response to a design concept I had sent her in year 2. I had saved that email. I had saved all of them. I had not built a legal case. I had simply been a person who took his work seriously and kept records of it. But when I spread all of it on my kitchen table that night, the sketchbooks, the printed emails, the hard drive, I saw it for what it was. 6 years of evidence. I called my cousin Deshaun the next morning. Deshaun was a paralegal at a small firm in Clayton that did mostly employment and contract law. He was not a fashion attorney, but he was smart, methodical, and had known me since we were both 7 years old building Lego sets on the same floor. I told him what I had, not the emotional version, the factual version, the documents, the timeline, the NDA, the employment contract, the 6 years of design work with concurrent documentation. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Adrian, that NDA. Do you still have the original?" I said, "I have a copy." He said, "Send it to me tonight. And Adrian, don't do anything yet. Let me make some calls." Deshaun called me back 4 days later. He said, "I talked to 3 people, an employment attorney, an IP specialist, and a woman who's handled fashion industry contract cases specifically. They all said the same thing." I said, "What did they say?" He said, "That NDA has a problem, Adrian, a significant one. There's a doctrine called unconscionability. A contract can be declared unenforceable if its terms are so one-sided that no reasonable person would have agreed to them with full understanding. What she had you sign, a permanent assignment of all creative work with no attribution, no residual rights, no buyout provision. 3 attorneys looked at it and all 3 used the same word." I said, "What word?" He said, "Unconscionable." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "Deshaun, if that NDA doesn't hold, what can I do?" He said, "Adrian, what do you want to do?" And I told him, "All of it." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Then let's build it right. Because if we're going to do this, we're going to do it in a way that she cannot touch." Deshawn's contact for the IP case was an attorney named Sandra Park, 38 years old, based in Clayton, Missouri. She had handled 4 fashion industry intellectual property cases in the previous 6 years. She reviewed my documentation over a weekend. All of it. The sketchbooks, the digital files with timestamps, the email chain, the employment contract, the NDA. She called me Monday morning. She said, "Adrian, the NDA is the first thing." Deshawn was right. I believe it's challengeable on unconscionability grounds. The permanent total assignment of all creative output with 0 attribution and 0 residual compensation in an employment context where the power differential was significant and the employee had no meaningful opportunity to negotiate. That's a strong argument. I said, "And the emails?" She said, "The emails are extraordinary, particularly the one from year 2. Exactly what I wanted to say. That is an admission, in writing, that the creative direction originated with you, combined with the time-stamped digital files showing creation dates that precede any documented direction from Patricia Varon." "Adrian, this is not a weak case," I said. "I don't want to sue her." There was a brief pause. She said, "Tell me what you want." What I wanted was not complicated, but it required explaining, because most people who come into a lawyer's office with a strong case want the lawsuit. They want the courtroom. They want the moment where the other person has to sit across from them and hear a judge say they were wrong. I understood that impulse. I had spent 6 years feeding it without meaning to. But I was 32 years old. I had 6 years of documented design work. I had a brand concept I had been developing quietly, sketching on weekends, building the DNA of it in my head, since year 3 at Varon. And I understood, with the specific clarity of someone who had spent 6 years watching how the fashion industry worked from the inside, that a lawsuit would make me the story for about 2 weeks and then make me a cautionary tale. Designers who sued their former employers were not interesting. Designers who built something better, Dordor. I told Sandra what I wanted. I wanted the NDA invalidated, or a written agreement from Varon that they would not pursue action if I launched independently. I wanted documentation that my work was my own, and I wanted to launch WJR publicly, with the full story of its origin, in a way that the market could respond to directly. Sandra looked at me for a moment. She said, "The Kickstarter angle. You want to make the documentation part of the campaign." I said, "I want people to see the sketchbooks, the emails, the timestamps. I want the evidence to be the story, not the lawsuit, the work." She said, "Patricia Varon is going to try to stop you." I said, "I know. That's why I need the NDA dealt with first." Sandra sent a formal legal letter to Patricia Varon and Varon's counsel in the 3rd week of November. It laid out, precisely and without drama, the unconscionability argument regarding the NDA, the documented evidence of creative origination, and the specific relief sought. A written non-pursuit agreement allowing Adrian Morse Jr. to launch an independent fashion label and publicly discuss the creative work he had performed during his employment at Varon. The alternative, the letter noted, was litigation, at which point the full evidentiary record, including the email correspondence, would become part of the public court record. Varon's counsel responded in 8 days. There was a negotiation. 2 phone calls between Sandra and Varon's attorney that Sandra described to me as tense but productive. Patricia Varon had not taken the letter well. There had apparently been a reaction that her attorney had then spent considerable effort managing. But the math was not complicated. A public lawsuit with those emails in the record was worse for Varon than a quiet agreement. Patricia Varon had built a brand on the perception of creative authenticity, the email that said exactly what I wanted to say, in response to a design I had created before she had expressed any direction at all, was not something her brand could survive in a courtroom. In December, we reached an agreement. Varon would not pursue action against Adrian Morse Jr. for launching an independent label or for publicly discussing his creative contributions during his employment, provided no confidential client or supplier information was disclosed. The NDA, as it applied to attribution and independent creative work, was acknowledged as unenforceable. I signed the agreement on a Thursday afternoon. Deshaun was with me. He read the whole thing twice. Then he looked up and said, "Adrian, you're free. I spent January building the Kickstarter campaign." The campaign page was not a pitch for a fashion brand. It was a documented history of 6 years of creative work. I posted the sketchbooks, scanned, high resolution, with the dates visible. I posted the digital file metadata showing creation timestamps. I posted the email chain, redacted of anything confidential but with the key correspondence intact, including exactly what I wanted to say. I posted side-by-side comparisons, my original sketches, dated, beside the final Voron pieces as they appeared in the press coverage. I wrote the campaign text myself, no copywriter, no agency. I sat at my kitchen table and I wrote in the same voice I had used in the sketchbook annotations for 6 years, direct, specific, without self-pity. The campaign goal was $50,000, enough for initial production on a 12-piece debut collection. I launched on a Tuesday morning in February at 9 a.m. I need to tell you what the next 72 hours looked like, because I want to be honest. I expected a response. I had been careful and methodical, and I believed in the work. But what I expected and what happened were not the same thing. By noon on Tuesday, 3 hours after launch, the campaign had raised $18,000. I was at my part-time job. I was doing freelance graphic work for a printing company in Midtown St. Louis to cover rent while I built WJR. I checked my phone at noon on a break and looked at the number and looked at it again. By 6 p.m. Tuesday, the campaign had raised $67,000, $14,000 over goal in 9 hours, fully funded. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the printing company, and I did not move for about 4 minutes. Then my phone rang, a number I didn't recognize, New York area code. I let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was from a journalist at a fashion industry trade publication who had seen the campaign and wanted to talk. I called Sandra first. I said, "It's happening faster than I thought." She said, "How fast?" I told her the number. She said, "Adrian, don't talk to anyone until we speak. Give me an hour." By Wednesday evening, 36 hours after launch, 3 things had happened that I had not anticipated. The first, the campaign had been shared by 2 fashion industry accounts with significant followings. Not celebrity accounts. Industry accounts, buyers, journalists, working designers who recognized what they were looking at when they saw the documentation. People inside the industry who had spent careers watching this dynamic play out and who, apparently, had been waiting for someone to put the evidence on the table publicly. The second, 2 former Voron employees had contacted me through the campaign messaging system, both designers, both with stories that mapped onto mine with a specificity that made me feel, for the first time, not like an isolated case, but like the visible part of a pattern that had been running for longer than 6 years. The third, a journalist at WWD, Women's Wear Daily, the same publication that had run the review calling the fall collection Patricia Varen's most personal work, had published a piece online. The headline was, "Designer claims 6 years of Varen collections were his work. He has the receipts." By Thursday morning, 72 hours after launch, the campaign had raised $280,000, 5.5 times the original goal. I was sitting at the kitchen table. My mother had driven over from Kings Highway. She had seen the WWD piece online. Someone had sent it to her. She showed up at my door at 7:30 in the morning with a container of the red beans and rice she made when something important happened. She was sitting across from me. She hadn't said much. She was just there, the way she had always been there. My phone was face down on the table. I had stopped looking at it every 5 minutes because I needed to be in the room rather than in the numbers. She said, "Adrian, how are you feeling?" I looked at her, and I told her the truth. I said, "Mama, I feel like myself. For the first time in 6 years, I feel exactly like myself." She put her hand over mine on the table. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I need to tell you what happened to Patricia Varon during those 72 hours, because the story is not complete without it. On Tuesday afternoon, 6 hours after the campaign launched, Varon's counsel sent Sandra a letter claiming the campaign constituted a breach of the agreement we had signed in December. Sandra read it, called me, and said with the specific calmness of someone who had anticipated exactly this: "They're trying. They don't have grounds. The agreement specifically permits discussion of your creative contributions. I'm responding today." The response went out Tuesday evening. Varon's counsel did not reply until Thursday, by which point the campaign had $280,000. The WWD piece had been shared approximately 40,000 times, and 2 other former Varon employees had gone on record with the journalist. They did not reply with another legal letter. They replied with a statement that said Varon had always valued the contributions of its design team and wished Adrian Morse Jr. well in his future endeavors. Patricia Varon did not post on her own social media for 11 days after the campaign launched. When she did, she posted a photograph of a sunrise. No caption. The fall collection, described in WWD as her most personal work, was quietly removed from Varon's website within the week. On Friday, 4 days after launch, I got a message through the campaign platform from someone I didn't know. The message said, "My name is David Chen. I'm a partner at Meridian Group. We're a fashion investment firm based in New York. I've been following the WJR campaign since Tuesday. I've looked at every piece of documentation you posted. I've looked at the collection sketches. I'd like to have a conversation, not about the Varon situation, about what WJR becomes next." I read that message 3 times. Then I forwarded it to Sandra. Then I went to my sketchbook, the black one, bought with my own money from the art supply store on Del Mar. And I opened it to a blank page, and I started drawing, because that's what I do. That's what I have always done. And for the first time in 6 years, everything I was about to draw was going to have my name on it. David Chen called me on a Monday morning, 10 days after the campaign closed. I was in my studio, which at that point was still my second bedroom, sketchbooks on the desk, fabric samples pinned to a corkboard I had bought at Target for $14.99, a rolling rack with 6 prototype pieces I had constructed by hand over the previous 8 months on evenings and weekends. The room smelled like the steam iron I had been using since 6 a.m. Sandra was on the call with me. We had agreed that no conversation with any investor happened without her present, not because I didn't trust myself, but because I had spent 6 years signing things I should have read more carefully, and I was not going to do that again. David Chen was 44 years old, precise in the way that people who manage significant capital are precise. Every sentence arrived fully formed, no wasted words. Meridian Group had backed 4 independent fashion labels in the previous 8 years. He had seen the campaign on Tuesday, reviewed the documentation through the weekend, and by Friday he had made up his mind. He said, "Adrian, I'm not interested in WJR as a trend story. The campaign was a trend story. What I saw underneath it was a designer with 6 years of professional level output, a clearly defined aesthetic, and the specific quality that is almost impossible to teach. The ability to make work that people respond to emotionally before they can explain why. That's what I invest in." I said, "What are you proposing?" He said, "Seed funding of $400,000 for a 30% equity stake in WJR. Full creative control remains yours, contractually, not verbally." Production support through our existing manufacturing relationships. Distribution introduction to 4 retail partners we work with currently. And 1 condition. I said, "What condition?" He said, "The first collection ships with your name on every single label. Not WJR, not a logo. Your name, Adrian Morse Jr. I want the market to know exactly who made this." I looked at Sandra across the table. She was already writing. I looked at the rolling rack in the corner of the room. 6 prototype pieces. Rust and silver and the Mississippi River at dawn. My grandmother's city, my mother's city, my city. Constructed by my hands on evenings when I was tired from the printing company job, but not too tired to make the thing I had been building in my head for 3 years. I said, "David, I have 1 condition of my own." He said, "Tell me." I said, "The equity agreement includes a clause that my creative attribution is permanent and irrevocable. Not as long as I'm employed, not as long as the relationship continues, permanently. Whatever WJR becomes, my name stays on the work I make. That's not negotiable." There was a brief pause. He said, "Adrian, that's not a condition. That's just how it should work. I'll have the attorneys write it in." We signed the agreement 3 weeks later. The debut WJR collection launched in September. 12 pieces, a small presentation in a gallery space in the Grand Center Arts District in St. Louis that a friend let me use for 2 days. I invited buyers. I invited press. I invited the 2 former Varin employees who had come forward during the campaign. I invited Deshaun, who showed up in a suit and stood in the corner with his arms crossed and the expression of a man trying very hard not to look as proud as he felt. I invited my mother. And I invited Odessa. My grandmother was 81 years old. She did not travel easily. My mother had driven to her apartment on Kings Highway 3 days earlier and helped her pack a small bag and explained what was happening. Not the legal details, not the investment, but the essential thing. That Adrian had made a collection, that it had his name on it, that she needed to see it. Odessa arrived in a wheelchair, pushed by my mother, wearing a dress she had made herself 40 years ago that still fit her perfectly, because she had never stopped taking care of the things she made. I walked her through the collection myself, piece by piece. I told her about each one, the fabric choice, the construction decision, what I had been thinking about when I drew it. She didn't say much. She touched the fabric on 2 of the pieces, the hem of the 4th piece, a structured coat in a rust-colored wool, and the sleeve of the 11th, a blouse in a silver silk that moved the way she had always told me good fabric should move. When we reached the last piece, the 12th, the closing piece, a dress that I had drawn in my sketchbook in year 3 at Varin and never shown to Patricia because I knew, even then, that I was saving it for something that was actually mine. Odessa looked at it for a long time. Then she looked up at me. She said, "Adrian, you see things." The same words. Exactly the same words she had said to me when I was 7 years old and showed her my first drawing at the kitchen table on Kings Highway. My throat closed. I stood completely still. In the background, I could hear buyers talking, the low sound of a jazz quartet Deshaun had arranged, the particular quality of noise that a room makes when people are genuinely engaged with what they're looking at. I said, "I learned it from you, Grandma." She took my hand. Her hands were small and warm and had made things for 60 years. She held mine for a moment. Then she said, "Put my name somewhere too." I laughed, actually laughed, the kind that comes from somewhere you didn't know was full until it empties out all at once. I said, "Done." The WJR debut collection sold out its pre-order allocation in 11 days, all 12 pieces. The rust wool coat was back-ordered for 6 weeks. A buyer from a specialty retailer in Chicago placed an order the day after the presentation. A second retailer in Nashville followed 4 days later. In November, 14 months after I had sat at my kitchen table spreading 6 years of sketchbooks across the surface and seeing them for what they were, WJR was acquired by a fashion group in an all-cash transaction. The acquisition price was $4.2 million. I kept full creative control. It was in the contract, permanently and irrevocably as David Chen had agreed it should be. My name is on every label. I want to tell you what happened to Varen, not because I spent time thinking about it. I genuinely didn't, and I think that's important to say, but because you deserve to know the full shape of the story. The two former Varen employees who had contacted me during the campaign both settled their cases with Varen in the spring. Both designers launched their own independent labels within 18 months, one in Kansas City, one in Nashville, and both credited the WJR campaign as the reason they decided to come forward. Varen lost its distribution agreement with its two largest retail partners in March. The fall collection that had run in WWD under Patricia Varen's name was never reissued, never re-promoted, never mentioned again in any Varen marketing material. Patricia Varen gave one interview in the spring to a regional business publication. She described Varen as being in an exciting period of creative reinvention. She did not mention Adrian Morse Jr. or the campaign or the settlement. I did not read the interview all the way through. I got about 4 paragraphs in, and then I had a sketchbook open and a deadline, and I had better things to do with my time. The last thing I want to tell you is about the label inside the 12th piece, the closing dress, the one I had drawn in year 3 and saved. When we went into production, I asked the manufacturer to add a second label inside that specific piece, a small one just below the main care label. Hand-sewn, not printed. It reads, "For Odessa, who taught me to see." Odessa is 81 years old, and she still sews on Sunday afternoons. She has a WJR piece now, the rust wool coat, the one she touched at the presentation, the one that sold out first. She keeps it on a hanger on the back of her bedroom door. She told my mother she doesn't wear it because she doesn't want to wear it out. My mother told her that's exactly the wrong way to treat a coat. Odessa told my mother to mind her business. I think about that conversation a lot, and it makes me happy every single time.
Adrian Morse spent 6 years invisible. Not because he wasn't talented, not because the work wasn't extraordinary, but because he was 26 years old with student loans and a job offer, and the women across the desk from him knew exactly how those numbers worked in her favor. What she didn't count on was this. Adrian kept every sketchbook, every email, every time-stamped file. Not because he had a plan, but because he was the kind of person who took his work seriously enough to keep a record of it. And when the moment came, when he finally spread 6 years of documentation across his kitchen table and saw it for what it was, he didn't explode, he didn't threaten, he didn't post something angry online. He built something better. Here is the lesson I keep returning to after today's 3 stories. Ray Kowalski, Brenda Coaster, Adrian Morse. 3 completely different people, 3 completely different industries, 3 completely different kinds of betrayal, but the same thread running through all of them. The people who dismissed them, who walked them out, who buried their reports, who put their name on their work, all made the same mistake. They forgot that the person they were dismissing had been paying attention the entire time. You cannot take 31 years of someone's knowledge and then be surprised when they still have it after you hand them the box. You cannot build a fraud on the assumption that no one is keeping a notebook. You cannot put your name on someone's creative soul for 6 years and expect them to stay invisible forever. Pay attention. Document the work. Know your value. And when the moment comes, and it comes, be ready to act with precision, not rage. That's the difference between people who survive these stories and people who become them. Next time, we're back with a story that has been sitting with me for weeks. a woman who worked in the same hospital system for 18 years, a hospital that kept denying her husband's treatment. And the moment she realized she was sitting on something that could change the outcome, not just for her family, but for everyone in that system who had been told no. I'll see you then. Don't forget to subscribe, because the people in these stories didn't wait for someone to hand them what they deserved, and neither should you.